Wherever you are.
Wherever you are.
Wherever you are.
Wherever you are.
Welcome to SGKs.
Welcome to SGK around the world.
Welcome to SGKs around the world.
Wherever you are.
Wherever you are. Welcome to SGKs around the world.
Wherever you are and in whatever time zone you're in.
Welcome to SGKs around the world.
Welcome to SGKs around the world.
Seja bem-vindo a SGK around the world.
We hope you enjoy the session.
We hope you enjoyed the session.
We hope you enjoy the session.
We hope you enjoy the session.
We hope you enjoy the session.
A gente espera que você curta a sessão.
We hope you enjoy the session.
Hi, I'm Christina Frayne, and I'm the strategy director. I work with a lot of different industries and a lot of different clients, helping them to define what their brand story is, and also digging into consumer insights to help inform that strategy.
Hey, I'm Nate Dickman. I'm an associate creative director. Have a background in architecture and kind of retail and consumer experience through environmental design. And I've really kind of spent the last 10 years or so thinking about, how to translate that into kind of engaging consumer journeys and brand stories, primarily in kind of the sportswear space, which, is fitting as we're talking about Kids Foot Locker today. There's kind of three parts, I think, and I was actually going back and kind of re-looking at our brief, which is always helpful to do even after the project's done, and really kind of thinking about what were the goals coming out of these new concept stores. And I think there was three parts. The big one was, these are kids stores, but we know, and I'm sure when we talk about kind of demographics, that Christina also had some insight there, but when kids are shopping, their parents are really doing a lot of the shopping. And so it's really important, obviously, when thinking about a kids store, that you really need to engage both kids and parents. And I think we'll obviously talk about what that means, but that's obviously a really important thing. And kids, sometimes you might be shopping for your 5-year-old, but you brought your 15-year-old along because you're running errands. And so thinking about kids of all ages and then their parents is a really important part of these Kids Foot Locker stores. But in doing so, I think KFL is really interested in trying to make these a community door, which is always an interesting idea, thinking about a big international brand and what it means to be community. And I think we've seen over the years some brands go hyper local, where they have store teams. The stores look different in different environments. Their store teams are deeply embedded in the communities. And what that means for Kids Foot Locker is that a lot of these doors that they're putting in, they're off mall, they're in strip malls, and they are in communities that Kids Foot Locker is interested in investing in, because I think they actually already mean something to the community. So people are already using them as places to go and for kids to hang out while they're shopping and do homework and do all of these kind of things. And so they're really interested in, I think, kind of recognizing and really making sure that as they were going to go in and kind of introduce this new concept, that it was really providing some actual amenity for the community. And in doing so, kind of the takeaway is that they want to make a more democratic and accessible sneaker culture, right? So I think they obviously understand, and we all realize they are one of the leaders in kind of global sneaker retailers, and thinking about how to make sure that, as that broadens and as that industry and that culture continues to grow, that is something that's really accessible for everybody. So kids and parents alike.
Yeah, and one thing to add to that I know, not working as much in retail as Nate does, that I was very surprised by, and one of the key challenges was the size of the community door store. So just the amount of footprint to fill and how we would do that in a way that didn't just feel like we were pushing more product, but actually going to serve the community, as Nate mentioned. So we really tried to think of that as we uncovered the insights and thought through what those store innovations would be. Kids Foot Locker actually came to us with a lot of their own research and insights, but it was a little bit of a dump of here's a bunch of really great information. And sometimes when you do that, there's not really clarity in terms of, well, what does this mean for the opportunity that we've been tasked with? So part of our job was to figure out, how do we distill down this wealth of information into these digestible nuggets that will be meaningful to the creative team, but also where are those knowledge gaps? How can we supplement that with insights of, either what does the Kids Foot Locker brand really mean? what's happening in the marketplace in terms of retail trends, and also what are some of those key insights from a cultural standpoint for the key demographics that we are going after. So as Nate mentioned, one of the objectives was to appeal to all members of the family. And so what that means is we're looking at Gen Alpha, which there's a couple of different definitions floating out there, but it tends to be like 10 and younger. And there was actually a business focus to go after what Kids Foot Locker calls littles. So Nate, correct me if I'm wrong, but that's like 5-year-olds, sort of like, expanding that footwear collection. So we know we have to appeal to those children, but obviously they're not the ones who are making the final decision. It's their parents, and those tended to be the millennial parents. So it's thinking of, well, what's the mindset of a Gen Alpha who's still trying to figure out their own personal preferences. They actually just want to engage with the store more than think about like, which brand do I want? But as they, age, they do actually start to have some of those preferences, but those tend to be shaped by their parents. So we did see some similarities between millennials and Gen Alpha, whereas Gen Zers are that cohort that's wedged in between Gen Alpha and millennials. So I think it's 10 to 12 to 25-year-olds. And so they obviously have a little bit more defined yet still fluid identity. But also have purchasing power. So if they're coming to the store, they're not having to ask mom or dad for guidance. They're just wanting something that connects with what they're interested in. And if they're going to the store with their younger siblings, it's an experience that they're not going to be, complaining about. It should be a destination that they actually want to go and engage with. So I think one of the important things that we stepped away from after digging through all their research and supplementing it is that there are similarities. I think, it's kind of the obvious stuff across all three generations. They're all tech savvy. The younger you go, the more tech native they are just by, the nature of technology. They all value social issues. So things like equity and inclusion and sustainability are all increasingly important. And, younger generations feel like they have this kind of charge or weight on them where they have to kind of solve for some of the problems of older generations. So we wanted to be mindful of how do we set this community doors up for success in the far out future as well. And they're all very hungry for actual experiences. The way that they see retail, especially aspirational retail, is one that feels immersive. It can't just be a place that's pushing a bunch of product. It needs to be something more than that, as brands have taken a much more personalized role in consumers' lives. So a lot of similarities between the three. And what we noticed is the differences weren't so much about the demographics. It was actually more what life stage are these people in? So as Nate mentions, if you have a younger kid as a parent, you're going to guide it a little bit differently than if you have an older kid. And also just your needs are different. If you are a younger parent with a younger kid, you might not yet know what's the way to fit my kid's foot, or what are the things I should be looking for these types of moments in their life. So you're looking for a little bit of more expertise when it comes to the shopping experience. And you're also looking for something that'll make sure that you can actually be in the store long enough to buy the product without your young kid kind of wandering off or kind of, being distracted or uninterested in that moment. Versus someone with an older kid, you want them to be engaged for different reasons. So I think we have to think through like what life stage are these different parents in, their kids in. And also, of course, there's no monolithic family out there. There's a lot of differences between the types of parents. So we did look at some of the segmentation studies that Kids Foot Locker provided us, where there's some parents that are more interested in more of the sneaker culture and streetwear and nostalgia, and others who are going to be more driven by a little bit more of the performance and functionality. So how can we appeal to those different types of parents as well? There was no desire to kind of hone in on one. It was actually how can we grow and expand to welcome more families into the brand?
Yeah, and I think in thinking then about how we started to translate some of what we uncovered through kind of unpacking and synthesizing all the research that Kids Foot Locker brought to us is, in looking at some of the differences between the generations that Christina mentioned, right? Like one of the things that came up that we kind of kept talking about was the idea that I think is, been discussed a lot, and I think is going to impact brands and others is, the idea that Gen Z, for example, their idea of gender and having these rigid lines, or that, a lot of times you're going to see teenage girls shopping in the men's section. Usually that's happening more than the other way around. And that they're not necessarily needing to be spoken to in these rigid lines of like, here's a section that's for girls and here's a section that's for boys. But that their parents that might be also in there shopping for an even younger sibling, there's a kind of maybe aren't quite caught up to that same level of just ease around like a shirt's a shirt, a shoe's a shoe, whether it's got pink on it or, but I don't care. They might not quite be there, but also there's just clarity of like, I've got 2 kids in the store and I need to get some things done. And worried about, to Christina's point, trying to figure out what size my kid's shoe is. And I just need to know like, where is the girls' stuff and where is the boys' stuff? And so we really, I think, based on some timing too, made a decision not to engage super heavily in, I think, some of the merchandising and kind of picking apart the way some of the product is displayed and the actual shopping experience is organized, but rather in these stores that are quite big, to Christina's point, but when you think about, there's actually quite a lot of program packed into them. How do we create these kind of nodes of energy that are moments that everyone can celebrate? And as we're working across generations and think about all the complicated factors, like we're not going to hit it right for every single one, right? We're kind of trying to create this broad appeal. So it then really became focusing about some moments around play, which, I think we're going to talk about kind of in this next question, that is a place where Kids Foot Locker can own authentically, that work across generation. It's something that's fun for parents, it's fun for kids. And regardless of kind of where and how you're shopping, it's literally these centers of gravity, if you will, that all kind of speak to each other and start to choreograph this experience within this overall kind of shopping destination environment. So the House of Play as a concept, and I think, it actually kind of predated that into to the title of kind of what we're talking about today, was really around this idea of the power of play. So in some of this initial strategy that we pulled together, both, Christina and the strategy team, and then on our kind of design team, we were kind of pitching back and really sharpening that perspective for the client. And it really ended around this idea that as they're thinking about all of these different generations and how to start building inroads and building a relationship with kids that will continue and last as they age out of Kids Foot Locker into regular Foot Locker. Because let's not forget, there's a whole other, adult life, that Foot Locker's got all these other stores and all these other different brands. That, traditionally where Foot Locker lived was sport, right? That's why they still have all their employees are called stripers. They wear the referee uniforms, not referred to that way anymore, because traditionally you sold sneakers by, and I'm in this room, by appealing to the fact that everyone loved Michael Jordan, right? Kids are more likely these days to buy a sneaker because Maluma wore it, or buy a pair of Crocs because Diplo did a collaboration. Like, music is huge. Our influencers are huge. The sneaker culture is so much bigger than sport. And so really we kind of were saying, well, how do we start to engage music and art and, food, like all these things that kids are into? And it was just this idea of play. Play is universal. Adults play. We should all play more, but we still play. Kids are playing all day, every day. That's just how our brains are naturally wired to work, right? Initially. And so, and because sport is rooted in play, and Foot Locker as a brand, and therefore Kids Foot Locker is rooted in sport, owning this idea of play is super authentic. It's not them extending into a space where they don't have room and they don't belong. Like, the idea that, hey, the conversation that we're going to have about this shoe and this collection or whatever that has to do with an artist or a musician or what have you, that's a totally authentic thing that doesn't feel foreign for them to say, hey, we can only talk about basketball, or we can only talk about soccer or what have you. So that was kind of the initial idea of like, you own play, you already do. Let's just think about it in a really broad way. And then we have all kinds of room to say, is that playing? Great, let's pull it in. Is that playing? Great, let's pull it in. Because I don't know if we've talked about this yet, but these first few stores are really tests. And so there was a lot of openness to like, let's try it. It's play. We can pull it in. It might not be the right specific kind of play, and we might learn from it and tune it, and that's okay. So that was really kind of where we started building this platform of play that Christine and the team really kind of then helped shape into this idea of House of Play.
Yeah, and I'll just add to that again, the client came to us with a little bit of a start point, and they'd obviously run like a brainstorm session. And I remember when the team gave us the download of documents, it was like, here's a laundry wish list of just like activations that we're excited about, everything from like, here's a like funhouse mirror type thing, and oh, can we do like, it was just very like activation, not anchored in any meaning or relevancy with the community doors concept. And along with that, they had identified 5 pillars of sport, play, education, connectivity, and creativity. And they're like, oh, these are the anchors that we think are really important. And there needs to be kind of these moments sprinkled across the community doors concept, along with that laundry list of ideas. And it was like, okay, how do we not totally throw away what the clients come to us with, but acknowledge it, but also say, how do we make sure it feels relevant for Kids Foot Locker, relevant for this concept, and relevant for the audience we're trying to push after? And with that, the insights like Nate has mentioned of, okay, play didn't seem like it was on the same playing field as all these other pillars. It actually felt like it was the connector of all of them, and that we could elevate play and not think of it, because they also had like identified like, oh, can we have like a playground in the middle of the store? And I think all of us were like, oh, we don't just want it to be like this playgrounds, like that just feels like, well, what does that mean to the brand, and how is this a community concept? So we thought, okay, well, play is important. And there's actually this trend of thinking of play more as a mindset, not as an execution. And, it is universal. It means all these other really important things that can be the filter by which we think through all of these store innovations, and relationship back to the Kids Foot Locker brand. So I think it was really beautiful. And that's really the role that strategy should play, is providing an anchor and guidance so that there's built-in meaning for what you're doing. It just doesn't feel like a bunch of random fun ideas that are novel and won't have build towards equity or loyalty with the consumer base you're looking to do that with.
Yeah, you were right that was we did have those 5 pillars and really elevated play. And I think what that allowed us to do, to your point, was think of play less as a thing that children do on a playground and more as a state of mind. And so, thinking back then to the idea that these are community doors, we wanted to be sure that then as play organizing around the pillars that included creativity, included education, right? How are we, one could just say, well, in playing, you're creating, and, but we wanted to make sure that we could start to at least have the conversation around facilitating and supporting all of these pillars in the stores and these community doors. And so, to Christina's point, the answer wasn't a playground in the store. There are elements that I think look and feel that way, but it was more about these kind of literal and figurative platforms that can be played on. They can be climbed. Some things can be climbed under. Some things can be. We've got these high jump things where we can go, kind of speaking to the sport legacy and history of Kids Foot Locker, where we can go and see how high kids can jump. If you give them a competition, like, they'll eat it up, right? It's actually one of the most successful things in the store, that we celebrated, kind of even bigger from one store to the next. But that also, this thing that is a climbing structure can also then be a small kind of auditorium like structure. So you can have someone come in and host maybe a talk, and maybe it's someone from the community. Maybe there's a local athlete from the high school that are coming in. Whatever that may be, that as specific program starts to layer over these kind of fun, colorful, bright, but albeit kind of generic, intentionally so, forms that are meant to be kind of open and democratic, that's where you really start to think of this as a community door. So there is an area in both of the stores we did in Dallas and Miami where it's just a big table with some seating around it. Really, what we found is there was a really great need for a place to do homework. They actually host tutors in there, really trying to embed themselves in the community in that sense. But it can also be a big arts and crafts table that is more literally kind of centered over play in that sense. And so I think, that's where play and community really interact, is that we wanted to make sure it wasn't so specific to like kids playing that it then prevented you from doing things like hosting talks. Something could easily become a DJ booth when they want to have an event, or there's maybe some kind of dance class. I mean, I think that part, we're still understanding how that layer is coming into these stores. And that's, I think, a really important part that enlivens the actual physical design that we put in, and was a really important part of the strategy that we always kept kind of referencing back to as we were thinking about this house of play, and play as something that was much bigger than just kid stuff, if you will. I have what is probably not the like super insightful answer, but it is interesting to think about then how, we set up this really big strategic opportunity that says, hey, I think looking at the strategy, one could say you could completely rethink the retail model here and say, from all the fixtures up and down across every single thing, looking at it through this lens of play, right? You could end up with a really radically different looking store from any other kid's store. And I don't think that's the case here. You will find a very modern, but albeit kind of what you'd expect in a traditional retail model store, with some really interesting pieces put into it that are kind of tests of this idea of play. And the reason is time. I think we were really lucky in that we had a client team that was really open-minded and really interested in kind of pushing the envelope, but that all still was in the context of a big global, footwear retailer. And so there were some stores where we simply, by the time we got briefed in, they were already kind of under demo, and there were already some architectural drawing sets done of like, hey, this is the store going in. And so we had to be really quick and nimble. And I think luckily everyone on our side, on the client side, understood what we've already mentioned, which is these are tests. We're going to make some guesses. We're going to put them in. We luckily have a little bit of time between store 1 and store 2 to see what was working and what doesn't. And we'll figure out what we can affect from there. And so that was, I think, kind of our biggest obstacle. But the part I'm grateful for, I think, is that it didn't. It prevented us from any kind of analysis paralysis where, I'm the first to admit I'll do this, where you just are kind of, you'll think it over and over and over and again. Like at some point we just had to do, and it was lovely because then, we put the first door in, and day one, the doors open and there's kids in there and they're playing with stuff. And we learned all kinds of things. We're like, oop, that didn't work. Or we thought that was going to be cool, and they don't care about it. But there was a lot of things where you're like, wow, like we'd really just put some graphics on a column that looked like a high jump, and there was kids in there for like an hour that kept playing with that, so it was really nice to just be quick and not have the pressure of, if we don't get it right in this first one, then the project's off, we failed. And so I think, it was kind of a double-edged sword that way, but definitely was a challenge in that timing for sure. There was some, in the couple of weeks leading up, there was some sweating, obviously.
Yeah, and I'd say that I can appreciate the challenge that the creative team had to take on. But one of the beautiful things of the way that this was sort of like mapped out, at least in the beginning, was that there was this parallel path between these two kind of first initial stores, and then the bigger blue sky, like this is what we want to do kind of longer term. And I didn't feel that, strategically we were stifled into like worrying so much about the realities that would have to happen very quickly. It was like, oh, what do we actually want this to be? And then how do we boil that back to, well, what can we actually do with these, 2 footprints that we've been given, and can't have a tremendous, impact on the way that that's shaped. Because I think what generated a lot of excitement, both internally and with the initial discussions at the client team, were some of those bigger ideas that helped them see how this would be those stepping stones to get to this bigger kind of revolutionary idea for Kids Foot Locker. I think you mentioned it already a little bit, Nate, in terms of, that connection to sport, and even, the uniforms of the staff and the referee kind of reference. I know that that's kind of how Kids Foot Locker was rooted in my mind. So we had to think like, well, how do we not totally forget about, what Kids Foot Locker might mean to those who are already shopping, and probably those who have seen it, as they've grown up. But how do we extend and kind of evolve the meaning of sport? And I think that's where the power of play helped us stay connected, but really redefine what it means. Because there was this one insight that maybe the rest of the team knew, but I wasn't as aware of, is that, team sports have been in decline among youth for like the last decade plus. So really that mindset of Kids Foot Locker being this team sport destination didn't make sense with where the consumers had evolved toward. So I think that was one of the barriers of what the legacy brands brought, but ultimately it kind of opened up this opportunity to redefine it as well.
Yeah, and there was, I think, something that has been happening that, Foot Locker's done well with just sneaker culture is I think, there's always going to be a brand is always going to have its legacy. In this case, it's in that idea of kind of sport. And I think, a lot of it being kind of basketball specific, depending on how far you go back. But that by being able to successfully translate that to just owning kind of sneaker culture as one of the kind of leading retailers, that is such a broad place to be. It means everything to everyone at this point. There are so many brands. You could find a sneaker that looks like anything or was a collab with anyone or was just about, things that don't look like we thought shoes were going to look, 20, 30 years ago, down to some really kind of typical conservative stuff too. And so in that sense, because we needed to be broad, there is enough breadth within that culture. And there's room to be fun and expressive and exuberant because the design of the shoes and the culture around it and the passion that inspires in people is exuberant and is fun and is all over the place in the best way. And so I think that coupled with the fact that the first store was in Miami also, as you'll see in some of the photos, really allowed us to kind of think like, let's have fun and let's make sure that when you open the front door or even before you open the front door, because we put this really fun dichroic film on all the windows, that this is really clearly like an expression of joy and exuberance and feels like a kid store and isn't fun that way. And if it didn't, necessarily look or feel like a traditional Foot Locker store in any way, that's totally okay. Which I think was nice because it's sneakers and they own a part of that. And so that just kind of translated, which, I think is of note too. There's one of the two stores is literally actually joined to a Foot Locker store. And so they're right side by side. And there was never any kind of trepidation or hesitation that like, is this going to be too loud or too kid specific or too big of a departure from what a traditional typical Foot Locker store looks like? Because it's sneakers and it's fun. And I think everyone was like, let's give it a shot. So.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that the creative team did really successfully was the graphic treatments and creating what is that graphic language for Kids Foot Locker in a way that feels like it is rooted in this idea of power of play, but doesn't feel too kiddie. Because I definitely think that there are certain stores where if you were to see it, you'd be like, whoa, this is like a kid's concept. And I know at least, for the long-term store, it was this idea of, well, how do we create a language that's obviously communicating to families and kids, but is elevated enough that it could potentially be a space where you might have multi-generational product in that store. Because imagine, maybe you want the same sneakers that your kid has. You wouldn't do that if it was like totally kiddie. So we wanted to really think about, what that visual language could be. And I think the team with a very tight timeline was able to create something that felt very successful.
No, that's a great reminder actually, as we were talking about then the actual stripe. I mean, the stripe is still an important part, and the distillation of that being an outgrowth of a referee uniform is still an important part of Foot Locker's identity. And so what we wanted to do was say, I think the brand at Kids Foot Locker and what they were using in store and in some of their kind of marketing previous to this project was some really basic kind of elementary shapes of triangles and squares, and kind of had them arranged in a pattern that I think, when not handled the best, really came across as very like preschool. And we know that we were trying to talk to, basically all ages of kids and teens. And so to Christina's point, I think we've got some really great graphic design team, obviously, that spent some time crafting a vision where we had the patterns that, you'll see in the photos, both are obvious reference to stripe. There's a lot of kind of linear line markings in them, but they're not at all 90s and orthogonals. They look very hand drawn, and there's a lot of color in them. And actually, there's 3 different versions of that to kind of map across the 3 different big buckets of age group, which is kids, little kids, and toddler and baby. And as you move between those sections, which all flow together seamlessly, and the graphics on the walls are not in these hard divisions, but one, you really start to look at one feels more adult and a little more composed. And as you kind of work your way down in age, it gets a little more exuberant. The shapes get a little more primary. and it's a little less abstract. And it's not something that's even meant to be perceived by the consumer in the store, that like, but it's just another layer of things to kind of reinforce shopping amongst these different age groups in the store. So that was definitely a piece of the legacy that we kind of took in and really owned, and viewed that as an opportunity to reinforce the idea of play just visually, but also kind of help reinforce some of the wayfinding between the ages as well. The original brief, we thought that these stores were opening so close together that we said we just have to essentially put the same concept into the second store. But I think we all hope and dream. Sometimes we write our briefs a certain way and then real life happens. And I think everyone realized that we, in a great way, learned some things from opening the first store in Miami, and really wanted to figure out what is possible. And some of them were very tactical. But I think a few of the big things that we learned from Miami was we'd put all these graphics on the floor that were kind of these evolved, kind of ultimate hopscotch things, thinking that kids, like anywhere from 3 to 6, 7 years old, might enjoy finding things that are down at their scale on the floor. And they're not traditional hopscotch where it's like go here, 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 but just these kind of abstract shapes that maybe have a few prompts like jump or spin, and that they would be able to find a journey with that. I think we were kind of naively thinking it was like that joke that you give a kid a present and they play with the wrapping paper, that like they'll find their way to play through some things that aren't so obviously play. But these stores are so full of product, and like sneakers are so fun. Like you walk in the kid and it's like they look like juice boxes or like juice packs, and they're just like squishy and colorful. And so between the product and the other experiences, we found that no one was interacting with those. They were just too quiet of a layer on the floor. So we were like, great, we're gonna nix that. But the high jump, which is quite literally it was an existing column in the store in Miami. We wanted to find a way to layer in a bit of some specific sport reference. So it was like, let's just give them a competition, and kids of all ages, all sizes seem to love it. And so we specifically built our own column because we didn't have them architecturally in the second Dallas store, and really made that a part of kind of the central experience, and put a leaderboard on it and kind of made it more of a thing. And that also, I think, leads into kind of the next big iterative thing, which was we did look at, well, what if this was digital? They have these digital high jump things that measure how high you can jump with some sensors, and then that can output on a screen. And I think one of the things we learned and thought about early on was we know that digital is important, as Christina mentioned really early on in talking about kind of generationally what's happening. A lot of these kids, they're digital natives. There's kind of a level of expectation there. And so, I think what we really looked for was we didn't quite have the time to build digital content and put it in store. For Miami, we did put in a big arch with some kind of brand graphics and some really fun colors and things that I think our hope is that that really does solidify itself as kind of an easy place to create some social content for kids. One of the things, sorry, I'm going back to some of the design concepts, but one of the things we learned from actually talking to the associates in store during the process was kids are already filming TikTok everywhere in the store. They're putting their phone on fixtures. They'll film it in front of the shoe wall. So knowing that we might not have time to build our own interactive digital experiences, really it was like, can we just drop in a few kind of tailor-made things that have a beautiful backdrop and a fixture in front of it that is an easy place to set up a phone and film yourself doing TikTok dances, whatever it may be. Even if half of them are being done by the staff in the store, that's great. Kind of helps with some local outreach and marketing stuff. But for the second door, we really wanted to say, how can we try and layer in some digital experiences without, again, really having the time to build them ourselves? And so we just found a couple different versions of play that we could put in the store. One is essentially an arcade table that looks like a small coffee table, and it has a whole bunch of games loaded onto it. And it's actually at the perfect height for young kids to go stand around and play things like air hockey, chess, tic-tac-toe, you name it, but it's all digital on a big tabletop. And so what we wanted to do was put that one in kind of the big kids area, thinking there might be some games on there where kids that are, 10, 12 and up can hang around and maybe play checkers or play digital tennis or whatever that is. But a bigger piece of that was a system called Lumo Play that one of the folks at Kids Foot Locker brought to us, and it's essentially a big projector with a sensor that projects on the floor, and as you interact with it, so as you move around, you can play soccer. There's all kinds of mazes. You can skin it with all kinds of content, but it's essentially a source solution. And it really takes a big, like 9 by 6 foot part of the store and turns it into a big interactive playscape. Because it's on the floor, we knew that kids of all ages were going to play with it. So we wanted to make sure that it was in an area where it was not about trying to cater only to the big kids or only to the little kids. But in that sense, I think we really kind of looked for what were some quick source things that we could integrate into the overall design that were going to bring a layer of kind of digital interaction into it, knowing that that's a kind of a big expectation on some of what's happening with kids today, and I mean I guess with adults too, really at this point. So those are some of the big ones, I think.
I think that's like what is exciting when you think about the future and more of these doors opening. I think it's amazing that the team has been so resourceful in terms of like the time and resources that they had to actually work with. But again, like thinking of like the bigger vision of how do we set Kids Foot Locker up for success to kind of redefine its role in consumers' lives, I think thinking further and getting more investment into really how does the physical, digital, and also programming all really work together to provide that meaning to community. To me, like that's what's most exciting about this project. And when I think of the future of what this could be, is really how do you deliver on being a community door and keep pace with the trends of what's happening culturally and what people are asking for in those specific communities. So I hope that we don't lose sight of that just because of the success of maybe like these 2 stores that opened. It's like, oh well, we were able to do them cheaper and faster than we anticipated. Let's just replicate that model across all stores. I really hope that the clients and our team are able to continue to strive towards that bigger goal.
Yeah, so in the original brief really is I think as we mentioned was let's think big and really kind of imagine what it means to be a kids footwear and apparel retailer today and 10 years in the future, and then how can we quickly pull that down into 2 stores that we kind of already really need to get going because they're already under construction more or less. And so we've done those, and I think we across the board feel like we got a lot more done than we thought, in a really in a great way. And so there was lots of learnings and lots of feeling really good about it. And so I think the next step that we're kind of hoping is one that we are able to take as part of the original scope is then taking a step back and saying, hey, the pieces that we didn't even begin to touch in these first 2 stores because we were moving so quickly, and said, hey, this isn't the time to reimagine the fixture package, right? This isn't the time to reimagine this because we've got to go. We can think holistically and in a really kind of rigorous way about, what does a wall bay look like in a store that's meant specifically for kids? We had all kinds of initial ideas on like, you originally remember you go shopping with your parents and all you want to do is like climb in the racks of clothes. What if there's something inside of there that is something that's just for kids? It's this little moment of joy. And how can we make sure that every little piece is reinforcing this idea of play for kids and their parents? And so I think we've set up a really great potential while also just executing 2 really great stores. And so to Christina's point, I think we're kind of hoping that we definitely can re-engage that original idea and promise of the brief, which is that there's an even bigger step coming kind of after this where we can pick up a lot of what we've learned, and then a lot of what we kind of set up in some of the initial strategy and really start to continue to push those into a really interesting, exciting place. Thanks for joining the session. Really appreciate you taking the time. If you have any questions, there's a chat box you should be able to submit and we will get back to you.